looking at the dangers of using spell checks on computers, that my name appears down as Diarmuid Martin. In the confirmation recently it appeared as doormat. I felt that was theologically probably more correct. A few weeks ago I was speaking to a parish priest in my diocese, and he said to me, "I'm a little worried about my curate." I said to him, "Well, what's he like?" He said, "Well, he's a hard worker. He gets on reasonably well with people, but he has a problem." And I asked him what the problem was. And the parish priest said, "He has a problem with a person." And I asked again, rather worried. But to surprise my answer, the answer came, he's worried about, or his problem is with Pope Francis. The curate was not at all happy with some of the utterances of Pope Francis, which he felt perhaps not in line with what he'd learned recently in the seminary. And he felt that the Pope was making the faithful insecure, and even encouraging those who do not hold Orthodox Catholic belief to challenge traditional teaching. My reply to the parish priest is that now we have a problem. And it would seem to me that this young man was probably the one whose security was being upset by Pope Francis. And later I began to reflect on this, because the young curate is not the only one who feels upset by the way Pope Francis speaks about many things. There are those who say that he's a communist because of his concern for the poor and his trenchant criticism of some aspects of today's market economy. But the more I reflected, the more I came to the conclusion that it was Pope Francis who has the problem. And his problem is with us, with all of us, because we all fall into the temptation of reading Pope Francis superficially and selectively. All of us are pleased with what Pope Francis says when he says things that we like. See, he has a remarkable talent for the one-liner, which instantly strikes and makes us feel that here's someone who's not afraid to speak clearly. And it's quite interesting that he has this ability to fit deep messages into a few words, which is the ideal gift in today's Twitter society. But herein lies the problem. Pope Francis' thought is more subtle than the one-liners. And when you read his document on the joy of the gospel, you'll see that he very quickly nuances what he wishes to say. And very often we don't look at the nuances, and we don't take the time to reflect on what he is really striking at. And similarly, we're all impressed by the many gestures of Pope Francis, especially at the consistency with which he retains the simplicity of his own life. But it's easy to admire the Pope's lifestyle. It's much more difficult to imitate it. So Pope Francis is a striking figure, particularly in public media, but we may not always realize the challenges that he's posing for us. Pope Francis is someone who has the courage to break away from accepted traditions and thought patterns, while most of us are trapped in traditions, very often without even fully realizing it. It's quite striking to watch how determined Pope Francis is to show that he wants to break away from certain traditions. And maybe some people thought that after a few weeks his minders would mind him and he'd go back to being Pope the way popes should be. But he is determined to show that his lifestyle is going to be different. Now, one of the reasons why we're trapped in our traditions is that perhaps over the years we've come to have a very conformist idea, a closed idea of Catholicism. I think we can say that about conservative Catholics and about progressive Catholics. We all very quickly become closed within our own ideas, and sometimes we don't realize that. Pope Francis, in the interview which he gave to the Jesuit magazine La Civiltà Cattolica, and I remember the day that interview was published, there was consternation in the Vatican that the Pope would give an interview with which the head of the Vatican press office, another Jesuit, didn't know about. And since then, he's constantly giving interviews. He's given another one over the weekend. But he spoke about the two poles of rigorism and laxism. Now, certainly, Irish Catholicism had a strong rigorist tradition. And I think we may have exported a part of that to Australia at some stage. Things were either black or white. Things were sinful or non-sinful. The only distinction was between mortal and venial sin. And the principle was, when in doubt, make it mortal. Today, there's a growing laxist tradition and tendency in society, but also in the church. We've lost a sense of sin, and there's a temptation to think that anything goes. Pope Francis is neither rigorist nor laxist, because he realizes that most people don't live in the absolute black and white world of those who sit in judgment. But they live in the day-to-day struggle of life, striving to be good in the midst of the struggle between good and evil. But neither is Pope Francis a relativist. He clearly sets himself within the tradition of the Church as regards doctrine. What he realizes is that the men and women of our times have to be met where they are, and they have to be led to a deeper understanding of the real roots of the message of Jesus. He says, pastoral ministry in a missionary style is not obsessed with disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be instantly imposed. People must be led to the very heart of the gospel, and it's from there they will begin not only to understand the teachings, but will begin to embrace the meaning, the beauty, and the attractiveness of the gospel. Now, there are some who would feel that we're again moving away from the certainties of the gospel. There are those who would say that the mark of true Catholicism is that of truth and certainty. Many of the great converts to Catholicism came because they found certainty there. But you have to be careful to understand what the certainty of the gospel means. Faith is always a risk and a leap into the unknown. The certainty we feel so strongly about may very well be a certainty of our own making. It may represent not the gospel, but a comfort zone which covers our fears of taking the leap of faith which would bring us closer to Jesus. Certainties can deceive. Doubt and seeking can be a healthy sign of respect for a truth we still have to enter into profoundly. It's also interesting to remember that Pope Francis speaks not just of the joy of the gospel, which was the title of his document, but of the joy of spreading the gospel, the joy of evangelizing. He quotes the Apparecida document of the Latin American bishops of 2007, of which he was one of the principal authors, saying, "Those who enjoy life most are those who leave security on the shore and become excited about communicating the gospel to others." Leaving security on the shore, become excited about communicating the gospel. So the joy of the gospel is never a sort of personal sense of satisfaction within myself. Quite to the contrary, the joy of the gospel will always leave me uncomfortable if I do not set out to share that joy with others. And the gospel, by its nature, builds community. The gospel is never just a gospel of individualism. The gospel community is always one which is truly evangelical in the best sense of the word. That's why Pope Francis constantly uses the term missionary disciples. He very rarely talks about laity and priesthood. We're all missionary disciples. The message from Pope Francis from the very beginning of his pontificate, and indeed the message that he delivered to the cardinals at the final general congregation just before the conclave, has consistently been about a church which reaches outward. A church which reaches outward and which is the opposite to what he calls a self-referential church. A church which is so preoccupied with itself. Just days before he was elected, Pope Francis made a remarkable speech to the gathered cardinals. It was a one-page, handwritten, you can see it's been published, one-page handwritten reflection at the end of the gathering of the cardinals. And in the last short paragraph, he spoke about the Pope, what he expected from the new Pope. This was 3 days before he was elected. He said, thinking of the new Pope, he must be a man who, from contemplation and adoration of Jesus Christ, helps the church go out to the peripheries, and helps the church to be a fruitful mother who gains life from the sweet and comforting joy of evangelizing. Now that phrase, the sweet and comforting joy of evangelization, is actually taken from Pope Paul VI's exhortation, Evangelii Nunciandi, which Cardinal Bergoglio regarded as one of the most significant church documents since Vatican II. But the idea that it's from reflection, contemplation, and adoration of Jesus, the church goes out to the peripheries. For Pope Francis, a church which closes in on itself ceases to be the Church of Jesus Christ. Evangelization and renewal in the church require that we all become missionary disciples of Jesus, capable of bringing the message of Jesus to the men and women of today, not as an abstract message, not as a code of moral do's and don'ts, but through a living witness to the joy of knowing Jesus. It's through the quality of our witness that we reach out. And we reach out to those who do not know Jesus, but also to those whose knowledge of Jesus has not brought them the joy that they seek. This is reaching out to those on the margins of society, but also to those who were wounded and hurt within the family of the church, to those who drifted away from Jesus as a result. And Pope Francis challenges the entire church to become witnesses to the Good Shepherd. Evangelizing, the Pope says, involves closeness to those we evangelize. Famous phrase, smelling of the sheep that we encounter. It involves bringing those we minister to a deeper knowledge of Jesus, not imposing our own views, but through being able to journey with them, to be alongside them, sharing with them the difficulties of life in today's world. Modern communications can be of great value in spreading the gospel, but distant communication can never replace the nearness to suffering and alienation which the message of Jesus requires. When we speak of a preferential option for the poor, we're not talking about a political program. We're talking about an attribute of God's activity. It's God who has the preferential option for the poor. And without real contact with the realities of the poor and the excluded, we'll never be able to enter fully into the logic of God, into the logic of the God revealed in Jesus Christ. And the Good Shepherd is a complex image. It's not about the bleached white sheep of the holy pictures. Sheep are dirty, they're oily, they're muddied, and they're muddled, and they're disorganized in their movements. And our evangelization then must reach out not just to the like-minded, but to those who are muddied and muddled, to those whose original faith has become murky, and those whose life's journey brings them to live within the complexities of the modern world, where it is so easy to lose direction. And the Good Shepherd is also an unorthodox shepherd. He's the one who's ready to leave the 99 to reach out and find the one who is lost. Again, let me quote Pope Francis. Rather than being a church which opens and receives, we have to try to be a church which goes out beyond itself. Goes out beyond itself to the men and women who do not come to church, who no longer know the church, who have left the church, and those who have become indifferent. These are not the 99. Maybe in today's world they are the 99, but these are those we have to go out and reach out to. Most of us feel a little uncomfortable about the idea of really leaving the 99 to find the one who is lost. It sounds nice, but is it reasonable to apply as a general principle? Could we not lose the 99 through our inattention? And we may even be concerned that the 99 might be happier if we forgot the lost one, that the church might be better off, or at least tidier, without some of those lost. The lost sheep may be the ones who make us feel uncomfortable. I spoke last week about a preferential option for those who are the victims of sexual abuse within the church. There's no way in which victims and survivors of sexual abuse in the church can be healed from a distance, or from any form of outsourced healing process. Healing can only come through being close to people in their woundedness. I think of that extraordinary gesture of Pope Francis when the general audience saw a man whose face was covered in sores. Pope stopped and came over to the man, and unlike what we would probably have done, Pope Francis didn't engage the man from a careful distance and asked him, "What disease do you have?" He simply kissed him. I know myself, a friend of mine was introduced to the Pope, and somebody said to her, this lady has a son who was very sick. And he didn't say, "What's wrong with him?" He said, "What's his name?" Extraordinary reaction, immediately seeing a person rather than a disease or something to victims of sexual abuse in the church, and not just sexual abuse, but victims of all forms of arrogance and insensitivity within the church community, and there are many. They should be actively sought out and embraced in healing. The church must become very much a place where people encounter healing rather than blame. Arrogance and insensitivity and abuse cannot be healed by the nice phrases of spin doctors, but only through a real sense of humility. And again, there are those who might say reaching out to leaving the 99, going out for the one, is too simplistic. It could lead to unforeseen consequences, perhaps even further financial litigation. All I can say is that what Jesus said about leaving the 99 is unreasonable and is imprudent in our terms. But that is what Jesus said, and that is what he is asking us to do. And for some, humility may well appear as making oneself vulnerable. But if being vulnerable allows you to come closer to the vulnerable, then it will foster healing in a way in which false certainties do not. The danger for a church which is in many ways under attack is to close ranks, rather than accept that it is time to go out to those who are anguished or angry or scandalized with the church, and to show that the church is a community which cares for them and for all those who live on the frontiers of abandonment and poverty, and for all those who are searching for meaning in their lives and have not received the message of Jesus because the church was too focused on itself rather than on the marginalized and the wounded. The church must be a church which reaches out, and Pope Francis speaks about this repeatedly, and he's not afraid to speak what I'd say about the small print, the details as to how this is to be achieved. I quote, "I dream of a missionary option that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, its way of doing things, its times and schedules, its language and structure can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world rather than for self-preservation, capable of transforming everything." This brings me back to the realities of a changing church like that in Ireland. In the Diocese of Dublin, we have 2 priests under the age of 40, and we have 44 priests between 70 and 75. And yet there will be more time lost to use the Pope's words, over times and schedules, over the loss of one 10 o'clock Mass, than over the real challenges of faith that we have to encounter. In a changing church, we can no longer continue to do things as we used to. And that applies, as Pope Francis says, to timetables and schedules, but it really challenges us to take a completely new look at what evangelization means. Our young people have lost familiarity with the language of faith, despite years of Catholic education. And it's no longer just that we have not been able to win the hearts of young people for the church as an institution. We are no longer winning their hearts for Jesus Christ. Now, in the first instance, this may not just be a failure in our preaching. It's also a failure in listening. There's a sense in which we're all afraid to look closely at what the Spirit is saying to the churches, for fear that the Spirit may be asking for more radical change than we wish. If we are called to bring the message of Jesus to those on the margins of society, then we have to listen to the marginalized. We have to listen to the poor and the rejected, but we have also to listen to the sinners and the confused. We have to have the sensitivity to hear what the Spirit is saying when the Spirit speaks from unlikely sources. There's no clerical monopoly of holiness or closeness to the Spirit. Clericalism misses the point of what holiness is about. Just as other forms of rivalry and internal bickering in the church do the same. Indeed, when Pope Francis lists the challenges which the church encounters in the Joy of the Gospel, one section is entitled, No to Warring Among Ourselves. He talks about spiritual worldliness, which leads to divisions in seeking power and prestige. He speaks of a search for exclusivity and the creation of inner circles, instead of a desire to really share the richness and the desire, the diversity of the entire church community. There are those, which he said, who prefer some group which thinks of itself as different, if not special. The richness of our Catholic tradition involves a welcome for diversity. I am a bishop of my entire flock, including those whose spirituality may not be one to which I am particularly attracted. But I am the bishop to my entire flock. But there are groups who represent not diversity, but exclusivity, whether on the left or the right or the centre. Exclusivity is not one of the criteria for discerning the sense of the true church. Exclusivity also is not something that we find just in others, but we find it in each one of our hearts. It's a bit like the phrase, I'm not a racist, but. We can all say, I'm very tolerant of all traditions in the church, but. There are real challenges in situations where the number of priests is falling, and there are still many services which a parish has to provide. And we have to begin again to learn to identify and refocus on what is essential. People who have become estranged from belief and religious practice, they'll be attracted back to the church only when they encounter in the church gospel wisdom which touches their hearts and their lives. So our church has to focus more and more on forming faith communities into places where gospel wisdom is developed and shared. And we know that gospel wisdom doesn't grow in a culture of hectic. People seek silence and time and peacefulness and the ability to come to themselves. We had launched an initiative for confession just before Easter, and one of the most striking things the priest will come back, people need time. People want to have time to talk about their lives in depth. And the gospel wisdom will never then be the product of slick public relations gestures. Modern media offer new opportunities for the church, but they'll only offer opportunity to the church when they turn and inherent superficiality which they contain. Pope Francis notes that we're in an age of knowledge and information, but this has led to new and often anonymous kinds of power. We use media, but we also have to evangelize and be critical of the media. But above all, to evangelize and transmit the faith, we must have a strong personal relationship with Jesus. We must identify with Him, and identify a church which is going to reach out must identify with Jesus in His own self-giving love. Pope Francis stresses that the evangelizer never ceases to be a disciple. We're first a disciple. And he stresses that if we lose that sense of discipleship of Jesus, we end up becoming, and I quote, unsure of what it is that we are transmitting. If we lose our sense of discipleship, we end up unsure of what we're transmitting. There's a danger in today's world, for example, that priests can lose direction and end up being so busy doing priestly things that they end up not being true priests. The priest is the one who knows Jesus Christ and who attracts people not because of things he does, because his faith in Jesus gives his life an integrity which allows him to be a true father to those he encounters. The priest who goes out, reaches out to the margins of society, cannot go out empty-handed. He must know the message that he's called to transmit. And going out into the peripheries of human existence is for the church not just a one-way street. There's a sense in which it is in going out that the church, the community of believers, discovers who she really is and who we really are. It's in our encounter with others that we realize the depth or the emptiness of our own knowledge of Jesus Christ. And sometimes it's an encounter with non-believers which helps us to understand the depth or the emptiness of our knowledge of Jesus. However, to refuse that encounter, to refuse going out into the complex world in which we live, may well mean that we prefer comfort zones of our own making, and that we are afraid or timid to go out, and we think that it's safer to keep the message for ourselves. When that happens, we can quickly find that we have indeed lost what we are really called to transmit. The task of preaching the gospel is the first task of the church. This is clear teaching Second Vatican Council. And Pope Francis asks, what would it mean if we were to take those words seriously? What would it mean if we were to say the task of preaching the gospel is the first task of the church? And he says, it will make us realize that missionary outreach is paradigmatic for every aspect of the life of the church. And he quotes again the bishops in Latin America. We cannot passively and calmly wait in our church buildings. We need to move from a pastoral ministry of pure conservation to a decidedly missionary pastoral activity. You can see the development of Pope Francis' thought from the Apostolic document to the speech before the election of the Pope, and to the way he understands his own ministry. For Pope Francis, the doors of our churches are of particular significance. They must be kept open so that those who wish may come in. I passed an Anglican church next door, and it reminded me of some of my churches. What did I see? A padlock on the gate. The doors of our churches must be doors which welcome all, and especially those who want to encounter the care and the forgiveness of Jesus. The doors of our churches, as they must be physically open, and at times they're not. But we have to make them truly open. Sometimes I think our churches are like airports. You've got security checks to keep out those who are respectable Christians might feel less worthy than should be there. But the doors of our churches must also be two-way doors, not doors which make it comfortable to sit inside. The church door must be also the space from which we go out refreshed and revitalized in bringing with us the message of Jesus. I return to my discussion with the parish priest and the fearful curate. Pope Francis has a different model, and he witnesses at the age of 77 that different model. He witnesses through an extraordinary commitment and enthusiasm, and above all, an inner freedom. He writes, and this is a longish quotation, "If something should rightly disturb us and trouble our consciences, it's the fact that so many of our brothers and sisters are living without the strength, light and consolation born of a friendship with Jesus, without a community of faith to support them, without meaning and a goal in life." Then he says, "More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our doors people are starving, and Jesus does not tire of saying to us, 'Give them something to eat.'" The challenge is great, but we should never lose hope. The biggest enemy today for me is pessimism. And the great ally of pessimism is pessimism. Pessimism is the mother of all self-fulfilling prophecies, and it's a highly contagious disease. In characteristically Pope Francis' language, Pope says, "One of the most serious temptations which stifles boldness and zeal is a defeatism, which turns us into querulous and disillusioned pessimists, sourpusses. That nobody can go off to battle unless he is fully convinced of victory beforehand. If we start without confidence, we've already lost the battle and we bury our talent." Pope Francis' answer is a radical one. There are many phrases which he uses. One of the ones I particularly like is where he said, "Religious life is not like a bottle of distilled water, safe, transparent, and tasteless." We have to have this real sense of commitment. We can be safe, transparent, and tasteless, and cause no harm, but it won't cause much good. He said we need a church constantly going out from herself, keeping her mission focused on herself and her commitment to the poor. And then he says, "God save us from a worldly church with superficial, spiritual and pastoral trappings." And he says, challenges exist to be overcome. Let us be realists, but without losing our joy and our hope-filled commitment. Let us allow ourselves never to be robbed of our missionary vigor. I don't know if you agree with me, but I am more enthused by the realism of Pope Francis than by the fear and insecurity of that curate I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. My prayer is that that curate, and many like him, will be moved by what Pope Francis says and does, and will overcome his security and rediscover the joy of the gospel and the joy of sharing the gospel in the world of today. I thank you.